So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back again to our another session of Asia Korea Society Youth Program 2023. And it is really great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Daniel A. Pinkston. Dr. Pinkston is a seasoned lecturer in international relations at Troy University, bringing a wealth of experience and expertise in the field. Previously serving as a Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director for the International Crisis Group in Seoul, Dr. Pinkston has played a crucial role in addressing complex geopolitical challenges. His dedication and leadership were also evident during his tenure as the director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. So in today's presentation, he will be more focusing on answering why the sustainable development is essential for the global future for our development. So Dr. Pinkston as well, to name some of his remarkable academic achievement. He is holding a master's degree in Korean study from Yonsei University and PhD in international affairs from the University of California, San Diego. So without further ado, let's just give the floor to Dr. Pinkston and let's have a good discussion. So Dr. Pinkston, the floor is yours.
Today we're going to talk about sustainable development. And there's a garbage dump right there for our first slide. And we'll go on to the next slide, please. Yes, okay. So first of all, generally what I do in my courses or any kind of research or project, I think it's always useful to have agreement or consensus on the terms, right? And even going back to Confucius and the Analects of Confucius, there's a passage about rectifying the names, getting the terminology right. So here are just a couple examples, 3 examples, one from the UN. And you could see there the first bullet point says, sustainable development is how we must live today if we want a better tomorrow by meeting present needs without compromising the chances of future generations to meet their needs. And then the second definition there is similar, but that's from the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK. So it's a commission in the UK, and from their domestic political perspective, they give their definition there. And the links to those organizations, you can unpack a lot more information there if you wish to do so. And then the third definition there is from the World Health Organization, UN organization. And of course, public health has been a big issue with, coming out of the pandemic and other public health issues that we have to address in, an age of globalization and travel and so forth, number of infectious diseases. So the WHO has their definition there as well. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, there we go. All right, so if you could just indulge me a little bit more here, another slide or two, just to get some definitions right, and so that we're on a common ground of understanding. If it's redundant, then that should be fine as well. So I wanted to just address production and goods in an economy, and this will give some basic understanding of why we have environmental problems, why we have commons problems, and so forth. If we look at this 2x2 matrix here, and if we think of a good on one dimension is excludability, and the other is a rivalness in consumption. So you can see if on the first cell up there in the upper left-hand corner, you see, yes, excludable and also rival in consumption. So that means you can exclude someone from having access to the good. So if you were consuming it, you can prevent or block someone else from consuming it. And if it's rival in consumption, when you use it, you consume it, it's used up. So that could be, a cup of coffee, for example. When you drink it, it's gone. No one else can consume it. But there are also goods that are rival in consumption, but you cannot exclude them. For example, fish in the sea. So out in the high seas, okay, you can argue that maybe you could send the Navy out there or whatever and block everyone out of the ocean. But for all practical purposes, it's not, realistic. And the problems with fish in the sea, they can be depleted. They can be fished out, and the stocks are gone. So that's a common pool resource. A club good is something that can be excluded, but it's not rival. And of course, these are kind of stylized, ideal types of goods. We call those club goods, such as bridges, like a toll bridge or cable TV. The club, the business club lounge at the airport. If you assume that the goods that are in the club are never ending, there's a limitless supply of peanuts and Diet Coke and draft beer. And once you get into the club, you can keep people out. You have to have your business membership. But once you get in, you can consume as much as you want. So those are called club goods. And then a public good, go back to this. So just last, public good, it's not excludable, non-excludable, and non-rival. Those are things like national defense, police, security, broadcast television. So when someone puts the broadcast out, as long as you have a receiver, you can get the broadcast. So those tend to be undersupplied, and that's why we have governments or international institutions that provide them. But main thing here, we'll talk about common pool resources will come up again, and how we try to deal with that both domestically and internationally. Now you go on to the next slide, please. And if you have any questions, you can put that in the chat, or raise your hand if you have any clarification questions. And of course, we'll have time for discussion at the end. So another issue in economic production that causes environmental problems are what we call externalities, negative externalities. So externalities are the costs or benefits not directly reflected in the price of a good. So usually we're talking about pollution. Those are negative externalities, and we normally don't have to specify. Usually in common discourse and public discourse, people talking about externalities, they mean the negative ones. Those are the things that spill out of the firm. So let's say you're making a product, textiles or a mobile phone or whatever it is, and there are chemical processes, there are waste products from that process. And then the firm, let's say they just dump it in the river, and then those chemicals go downstream and causes cancer or kills livestock or cause some other cost on people or organizations that are outside of that firm. And of course, they have a incentive. The firm has an incentive to pass those costs on to the public or pass it on to someone else, because the abatement or the cost of internalizing and taking care of those toxic chemicals would cost the firm money in doing that. However, there are also positive externalities, such as learning processes, know-how, and so forth, that goes on to a firm. And then people inside the firm, they can go outside and take that positive technology or know-how. But in environmental problems, we're generally talking about negative externalities. Let's see, let's go on to the next slide, please. So we have externalities in a domestic environment, air pollution, water pollution, things that are dumped out of, vehicles, automobiles, production processes, and all of that. So there's a domestic political process and regulatory environment that can deal with that or not deal with it, or different countries and different environments, regulatory environments, political systems deal with it in different ways. But we also have transboundary externalities. So pollution or negative spin-off, negative effects that go across the border, such as acid rain that go over international border into another country, wastewater runoff, say from agricultural production, fertilizers run off into rivers, and it goes into the ocean. I know this is a problem here in the Yellow Sea. A lot of agricultural waste runoff goes out into the sea from China, from Chinese farms, and that those chemical byproducts affect the water, and then of course affects the marine environment. It kills fish and so forth. So there are a lot of examples of that around the world. Ozone depletion. which has been dealt with relatively more successfully compared to some of the other problems. But that's chemicals that go into the atmosphere and damage the ozone layer that protects us from harmful rays from the sun. So tragedy of the commons, if you go back, think of those common pool resources where you can't exclude others from consuming or having access to the good, but it gets depleted or used up. So of course, if you're an individual, you have an incentive to deplete the resources quickly as you can before it before it disappears. The example of this is, let's say in a village, there's a common pasture and people have livestock, and everyone can go out there, bring their goats, their livestock out there, and they can graze in the field. But if it's overgrazed, then the grass in the pasture is killed off, and then there's nothing left for everyone. And of course, that's not sustainable. So we have to find ways to manage these, these commons problems. So overgrazing, overfishing, and deforestation are some of those problems in world environment. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So the challenges for the global environment and natural resources, we can put them into three main categories: problems with the atmosphere, damage to the world's water resources, and that has a lot of knock-on effects, for human sustainability, livestock, agriculture, and so forth. A lot of issues with biodiversity and so forth, and then damage to the land. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so I just put some sources up here for data. If you want to get data and reports, there's a lot of information out there. You can go to the UN Environment Program for air pollution data. There are other sources of data. With a couple of mouse clicks, you can see that online. Air Quality Index, that's another good source. You can look at different cities and look at the air pollution in different cities, find which countries have the most air pollution and so forth. If you want to get data on the world's water resources, the UNEP World Water Quality Alliance, you see the link there. They get data from different governments, states, international organizations, firms, NGOs, think tanks, and so forth. And then damage to the land, another UNEP site there. A lot of facts, reports, data on what they call the nature crisis. So there's where you can get some data if you want to follow this up. But let's talk about some of these things in a little bit more detail here. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So let's see, problems with the atmosphere. Notable examples include global climate change because of increased greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone should be familiar with that. That's a big news item. So there's differences in how to measure greenhouse gases, who's responsible for abatement, who should pay for the cost of internalizing those costs of greenhouse gases. Should a greater burden be placed on developed countries? Who pays for it, and so forth. So that all comes down to political issues and political problems that have to be worked out in international political setting, which has been quite difficult. And I'm a little bit pessimistic when I think about it. It gets depressing, but hopefully we can overcome this. There's data and information about climate change and some of the environmental damage leading to other problems with conflict, migration, and so forth. Ozone depletion, as I mentioned earlier, or the previous slide, this occurs due to chlorofluorocarbons. This was quite worrisome concern in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when they 80s when they noticed this. And this is the refrigerants, but it was more successful. The Montreal Protocol was more successful because there were alternative technologies. So there's hope that technologies can provide solutions to these other problems like we did with the Montreal Protocol. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so water resources. Some of the key examples are freshwater contamination, overuse of water aquifers, damages the water. I follow this casually, just as someone keeping track of the news, and I look at places that are very dry, very arid, desert areas that have large cities like Las Vegas or Phoenix, some cities in the Middle East. They're pumping water out of the ground, out of the aquifers for agriculture and, of course, human consumption and so forth. But this source, the water source, is being depleted. So how this is sustainable is a big problem. If you can come up with that answer, you probably win a Nobel Prize. Oil pollution in the oceans, and then threats to marine life, overfishing, hunting whales and so forth. And of course, that can have cascading effects on other species as it impacts the ecosystem. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so damage to the land, deforestation. This is often accomplished by burning forests. We see some of the major forests in the Amazon in Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia. So many of these farmers wish to develop their land. They cut down the trees. It's very problematic when they use slash and burn tactics or technology, cutting down or burning down the brush and so forth. And it releases carbon into the atmosphere and then impacts the life in that area. Birds and other lives, insects, the whole ecosystem. And then they use this for farming, but it can be a domestic political problem because, of course, the farmers and agricultural interests want to develop this land. So we see that in Brazil, as I said, in particular. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so how do we manage these environmental problems? So here I listed 5 factors, determine whether it's successful for efforts by NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We see both domestic and transnational organizations. Okay, great. We're in part 2 of the recording. So picking up from the first part, you see here the 5 factors or considerations in managing international environmental problems. And of course, the support of major countries is critical as well. And this is interesting. Recent research has shown that highly autocratic states and highly democratic states may be better able to protect their forests from deforestation. I guess they can, in the autocratic states, they can block or prevent interests from capturing the government or from influencing policies that would degrade the environment. But that's indeterminate because, of course, you could have an autocratic leader that would have no personal interest in protecting the rainforest or the land. So I think you have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so addressing environmental problems, there are 3 overarching approaches. One is a unilateral approach. So if it's a localized problem, that would be more successful. If it's a large country and it's a transboundary problem, maybe if a country takes a unilateral legal or regulatory approach, introduces a new technology that's successful, then maybe others will adopt that technology or those regulatory measures. Also, bilateral approaches, an example, US-Canada Air Quality Agreement. Multilateral approaches are actions taken by a group of countries or in international institutions. And we have the examples there of the Montreal Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, and more recently, the Paris Agreement. All right, let's go on to the next slide there, please. Yeah, so here's the example of Montreal Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement. Not going to read that for you, just take a look at that. Paris Agreement is much more recent. And in 2015, then it was announced. And then the Trump administration came in and withdrew from it. And then with the election of Joe Biden, rejoined the agreement. There was a lot of concern that if the U.S. did not participate in this, but it's not binding. It's targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction to keep climate change under control or keep us under 2 centigrade rise in temperature by the end of the century. And there are targets that countries have committed to, but we don't know if they will be able to reach them. Let's go on to the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is a little timeline of some of the UN efforts. I put most of them down here. With increasing awareness of environmental problems with industrialization, in the mid 20th century. In 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment was held in Stockholm. So this was the first, world conference focusing on environment as a major issue. And that's when the UNEP was established. 1992, the UN Conference on Environment and Development at Rio, the so-called Earth Summit, listed 27 universal principles. I remember this in graduate school in the 1990s. There was a lot of hope about this Earth Summit and the belief that we were really going to make a difference. I think the achievements have not met the hopes or the objectives, but nevertheless, it was put on the agenda. So also at the Earth Summit 92, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was established, Convention on Biological Diversity, and Declaration on the Principles of Forest Management. Also created the Commission on Sustainable Development. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And then in 2000, we had the Millennium Summit in New York with the UN. So there were 8 Millennium Development Goals. MDGs were established. You can see them there, mostly addressing, poverty, public health issues, reducing child mortality, addressing HIV/AIDS, environmental sustainability, etc. So in 2002, 2 years later, there was a World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. Not much progress was made there, but again, on the agenda and discussion of where to go forward with these MDGs. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, then 5 years after the Millennium Summit in New York, World Summit in 2005, this also included the responsibility to protect. So this, doctrine or idea that came onto the international public agenda from the 90s with the genocide in Rwanda, also the atrocities and deaths with the breakup of Yugoslavia. So this idea is that if states do not protect their citizens, non-combatants, people that pose no threat to anyone, basically, if state does not protect them, then their sovereignty or right to rule should be challenged, and the international community arguably has a responsibility to intervene and violate the sovereignty norms to protect citizens. 2010 Millennium Development Goal Summit in New York. So this addressed global strategy for women's and children's health. So again, public health was put on the agenda in 2010. And then in 2012, 20 years after the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, they had a follow-up. And this was kind of launching the idea of sustainable development goals and to put that together for 2015, the kind of halfway mark for those development goals or Millennium Development Goals that were established in 2000. So we see that it's expanded in 2015. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of hope and effort by the stakeholders in 2015. UN Summit on Sustainable Development in New York. So they changed the name from Millennial Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. Over 150 world leaders gathered in New York, approved this new agenda for sustainable development. The plan is called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by 2030. And this increased the number of goals and targets, from 8 to 17, 169 targets. And then after this, 2 months after this, the Paris Conference on Climate Change, so-called Paris Accords, were ratified by 187 parties in 2015. So we see a lot of momentum, a lot of ambition, a lot of buy-in. This has been kicked up to world leaders, heads of state, meeting to address this and expanding the goals. So let's go on to the next slide. And you can see them there, the 17 goals, addressing poverty, hunger, healthcare, well-being, education, development, and so forth. If you go on the website, there are a lot of reports and details on these. You can dive in or drill down into those different goals, development goals, and the actual targets and everything else. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so again, there are some links and some text directly taken from there. So this is from the UN, UNEP. Summit was just held in September in New York. So there's kind of an update on the progress that's been made since 2015. And it's overall, we're a little bit behind. We have to accelerate this. With a lot of instability in the world, it's difficult. Like I said, I'm a little bit pessimistic in the short run, but we'll take a lot of work to meet these objectives or meet these goals. Now, there's another organization that I'd said earlier in one of the previous slides. There was an organization, a commission in the UK. Other state parties have their domestic institutions or regulatory setting organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, that address these issues. There's also this Global Green Growth Initiative, GGGI, which is actually in Seoul. You see the website there. It was established in 2012. It's a treaty-based international intergovernmental organization, an IGO, dedicated to supporting and promoting strong, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth in developing countries and emerging economies. So the effort here is to link together, work together with the private sector, with NGOs, international organizations, state governments, the private sector, to push forward these objectives for sustainable development. One of the problems, one of the issues is technology. So quite often, firms that develop new clean technology, they don't want to transfer it, or they want to be paid for it. So how that's processed, how that's done in the marketplace is something that has to be sorted out. So you can check out the gggi.org website. And as I said, it's right here in Seoul, and the head of it is Ban Ki-moon, who was the former head of the UN, of course. Let's go on to the next slide. Dilemmas of development. I just have a couple more slides here. So good governance. Governance is, within a country. And you see the definition there. A country with good governance at home typically possesses transparent and consistent political and legal systems, combats official corruption, and protects property. These factors encourage individuals to save, make investments, and pursue technological innovations that promote economic growth. So having good governance, setting good standards for public health, for human development, education, environmental protection, biodiversity, and all of those things, it matters domestically. So quite often we can do more domestically in our own home countries, getting involved with an NGO or getting involved with politics or domestic regulatory organization. But of course, there are international or interstate processes as well, as I've laid out mostly in this talk or presentation. So let's see, let's go on to the next slide. So yeah, I just mentioned here resource curse. So states that are rich in natural resources get locked into resource extraction at the expense of industrialization and modernization. So we think of oil-rich countries, countries that are extracting, fisheries, logging, those types of things. Those can be very stressful on the environment, of course. And you see there at that the bottom part of that slide, reference to the state and international levels of analysis. So the national laws and institutions inherited from a colonial past often inhibit, but sometimes can promote economic growth. So again, the domestic governance matters or can matter. So you have to look at a case-by-case basis. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so there we are. There's any questions, comments? And then on the last slide there, I have my contact information. If you want to reach me or have any follow-up questions later, if you think of them, but I'm certainly willing to entertain any questions or comments now. We can open it up for discussion.
So, hello, Professor. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think one of my questions is about the kind of moral aspect of enforcing all those climate measures, especially to developing countries. So one of the mechanisms I'm studying a lot right now is the climate debt swap, which you might be aware is this mechanism where basically we're going to forgive some of the debt of developing countries, and in exchange, we kind of like enforce them to implement climate measure. But like I'm living in China right now, and like the narrative I'm always hearing around me is the narrative of, oh wow, you rich developing countries, you like polluted so much to reach the level of development you have, and now China is like a third of the GDP per capita of the US, and you ask us to decrease our CO2 emissions and to do climate investment, which is not as efficient in terms of growth producing, despite the fact that we need development far more than you do. So I think it's how would you justify those kind of enforcement of climate measure, and how would you justify the moral aspect of basically restraining development to those countries?
Yeah, that's a great question or comment. This is kind of a core political issue. So, one example, I remember, years and years ago when I first started looking at this issue with deforestation, the U.S., if you look at the U.S. In the Midwest, which is, massive farmland. The U.S. is a huge agricultural producer. They grow a lot of corn and wheat and soybeans and so forth. But it used to be forest. So before it was colonized and settlers went out into the Midwest or middle of North America, it was mostly forest, but they cut down the trees for farmland. And of course, this is the criticism from developing countries today. So when people criticize Brazil and say you have to protect your rainforest, or Malaysia or Indonesia or Central Africa, then that's the critique. You developing countries, you were able to do this 150, 200 years ago. Why can't we do it? And if we forego this pathway of development, we should be paid for it, or we should be compensated for it. So, yeah, this is round and round this political tension, and who should pay the cost, or if there are, I guess, foregoing the more costless ways of development, or developing with the possibility to spew all of these externalities into the global environment, then who should pay for that, or how should they be compensated? So, yeah, this is the center of debate. I don't have the answer. the hope is that technology or new technology processes will make it easier, so it's less costly and it's easier to develop. There are ways to do it without all of the negative aspects and the negative externalities. So I don't have the answer. If I had the answer to that, then I would get my Nobel Prize and everything else. We wouldn't be discussing it today, but that's the core issue, and that's what the debate is about. And you can see the arguments on both sides. And even if you agree, if you're a developing country, or excuse me, a developed country, we have to look at the politics, the domestic politics. So, getting buy-in, ratifying a treaty, drafting and enforcing, regulatory code or a legal code that would abide by those standards, or to pay developing countries, or to forgive their debt. Political actors, different political actors in different countries are going to have a say about that, and it might not be politically feasible. So this is why we're failing to make progress, or as much progress as we'd like, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I hope that's all right for Francois. If you have any follow-up, maybe you can just contact the professor directly. And we are going to Javon. And after Javon, maybe I have like some quick question. If anyone just raise your hand, then I know that you will be taking time to ask the question. So Javon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I have a question relating to, well, two questions actually. The first relates to the link between the environment and conflict. So Homer Dixon does research on this link between, the environment and how the environment, destruction of the environment can lead to conflict. So why is it that some scholars say that we should be careful of environmental determinism? And my second question is, you explained that highly autocratic states are likely to protect their forest from deforestation. So what is the case for highly democratic regimes? Is it that most of these countries are highly developed, so they will focus on these issues?
Okay, I hope I wasn't misunderstood, but I just quoted what some research had shown. So I think with the autocratic regimes, it's possible, but it's not necessarily true. And I think the argument goes along these lines that an autocratic leader is insulated from social pressures, from societal pressures. So a dictator doesn't face the kind of pressures from the electorate or society or certain industrial giants in their, in the country. So a dictator being less constrained or not being constrained could embrace environmental protection, but that's not necessarily true. So it just depends more on the personal preferences of an autocratic leader. So it could go just the other way as well. It's probably a mixed bag. We see many autocratic states that suffer from a lot of environmental damage, deforestation and pollution and so forth. I mean, North Korea is an example. Many African states, developing African countries, the same thing. There's a trade in toxic waste, so electronic waste and other waste from developed countries where, let's say, it's a stricter regulatory environment. You can't dump the waste, the components, the parts, the chemicals. And in a dictatorship, let's say, or an autocratic country that doesn't have, strict regulatory environment, pollution abatement laws and so forth, they will take the waste. So, a multinational corporation can pay them to take this toxic waste that, they can't dispose of, or it would be very costly to dispose of in the developed country. They take it to a authoritarian state and they just dump it, right? Regardless of the, damage or the environmental damage that's done. and the dictator can skim off money from it and doesn't care. You can dump it in the province or the region where the opposition is and the malcontents are, that kind of thing. So it just depends. And then with a democratic state, again, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. If pollution and environmental damage is imposing cost on people, then if their voice is translated into policy, we could see where it would promote or prefer environmental protection. As far as the conflict goes, my colleague from graduate school, he's a professor at University of California now, and he works on environment. And we've had a lot of discussions about this. I don't do the direct research or primary research on it, but he's very convinced of that. And he was, he's talked to me about the Arab Spring, for example, and the pressures on food security. He says that's an issue. Fires, forest fires, food shortages. People migrate, they have to leave, they're pushed out of their regions. And then for a number of reasons, that causes insecurity, cultural clashes, the cost of providing public goods, public health services, sanitation, education, schools, housing. All of these things can be very costly for the host countries. And this can, result in some political tension, some social clashes, and so forth. So I think there's a lot of evidence to show that, migration, massive waves of migration can cause a number of political and social issues that can result in conflict. It's not necessarily determinant every time, all the time, but it can create those pressures.
All right. Do you have any follow-up question, Javan?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So before we are going to Francois, I think I have a quick question to Professor. You mentioned about the Sustainable Development Goal, and then one of them, which is like the seventh one, is affordable and clean energy, right? Now, like a lot of technological invention or innovation is going towards the ocean or like marine-based power system. So according to your perspective, because like I'm also focusing on that. I'm currently researching in floating nuclear power plants. So according to what you are, what you believe, also like your perspective. So how can this technological information become the threat of the water sources, especially for the marine's life?
Yeah, I don't know. I would have to look into it. I have to, say that I don't know that direct answer. I think it would be naive to believe that, those types of systems are constructing those kind of tidal, power sources and everything, that it would not be completely costless or no negative externalities, on the marine life and all of that. I think one of the things I've been looking at more recently is space and space security. Also, we could have talked, I was going to put one slide on that with space debris, and that being an area as we become more and more developed in outer space, based platforms for internet, for, remote sensing, things that we monitor the environment, mapping services, banking, all of those things that are interconnected with space-based platforms. There's a big problem with space debris. And that's, again, one of these kind of commons problems. So recently there's been some improvements or some changes, some policy changes on that to force firms or space launch services to mitigate or to reduce the space debris, because that poses danger to all of these platforms. And one thing that's interesting, it seems fantastical or science fiction, but there's been a lot of progress recently in space-based solar energy. So when I first started looking at this, I thought it was, hogwash or, kind of fantasy that was, centuries away, but it's not that far away. And by capturing the solar energy outside of the Earth's atmosphere in space-based collection platforms, they can beam the energy to Earth. And this provides much greater energy than we could capture on the ground. So some of the estimates I've looked at, saying like in 100 years, couple of 100 years, if we continue our use of energy, as humans that we just use for different things and different products and things that we're going to develop, there's going to be a much higher demand for energy. So to meet that goal, that development goal, we're going to need a lot more energy, and as you said, at cheaper costs. So in a much longer term, that's a technological innovation that could help resolve that. So I don't know the answer for the ocean, the tidal energy, and what kind of externalities, what kind of impact that's going to have on sea life. But we have to think of those cascading effects, because sometimes we might think of, just having a slight impact on one species, but then it has these knockoff effects on other species, right? Because it's part of an ecosystem. So I think we have to think of that much more kind of complex, broad way. So hopefully technology will solve our problems for us. That's the optimistic viewpoint anyway.
All right, thank you very much. And maybe we are moving on to Francois. We'll take this as the last question, perhaps, because we still have like 5 minutes. If anyone would like to ask the question, maybe just email and contact the professor directly. Is it okay? Yeah,
Yep.
Then Francois, maybe you can get your question, and it's going to be the last one.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I wanted to follow up on Jivan's point, and also the different professor, the friend you mentioned, who did research on the Arab Spring, because there is a French professor which does, I think, fantastic work, which is called Jean Covici, who did a similar studies, whereby he says that unlike what a lot of people believe, what started the Arab Spring wasn't democratic movement, wasn't influence of Western cultures, wasn't social media, but was purely and simply food shortage. Because basically what happened the same years was that most of the supply for wheat in those regions come from Russia. And the same years there was a severe drought happening in Russia, which means that half of the supply was cut. And therefore Russia decided to not export most of its grain. And then you observe that of all the countries in the region, there is only 2 countries that didn't experience like violent eruption of revolt, which are Algeria and Morocco. And it's because Morocco has its own supply of agricultures, and Algeria had oil resources, which increased this year, which allow it to finance food. And I think that personally, it's one of the conclusions I came in recent years, which is I think the importance of political regime and of authoritarianism and democracy is a bit overvalued by a lot of analysts who think that, oh wow, this is going to be a revolution because it's a democratic system, or it's not going to be any revolt because it's an authoritarian system. I think fundamentally, what is far more powerful than the nature of a political system is if people are hungry. And being in China, like I was able to see how even in a system that is so repressive, last year when people were blocked out of their home and couldn't eat and couldn't work to get money, they went on strike. You can have the most authoritarian, Orwellian, totalitarian system. When people are hungry, there is nothing really you can do. So I would actually be therefore a tiny bit skeptical about you point that authoritarian system can sometimes repress social struggle. I think once more, being in probably one of the most repressive and efficient, like at controlling its own people state, I saw how last year you cannot do anything when people are really desperate. So yeah.
Yeah, again, you have to look at a case-by-case basis, look at the instruments of repression and authoritarian regimes, what the pathways to rebellion are, what the barriers to collective action for the malcontents and those wishing to rebel. So sometimes when people are so desperate and there's such extreme food insecurity, you're just trying to get through your meal or get through this day. It's difficult to take collective action and to become involved in politics. So quite often we've seen political revolutions or when expectations are rising. So there's actually some development, but it's not reaching the aspirations of the people, and so there's kind of disappointment. We saw waves of democracy in East Asia back in the 80s, democratization in Latin America, Eastern Europe, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that. So people weren't extremely desperate then. So again, we have to look at case-by-case basis. But certainly when people are hungry or they're facing their demise through starvation, people do desperate things, especially for your families, or if you have children. Maybe I could suffer myself, but certainly for my son, I would do anything to get him food and water to sustain him, right? So people will do very, very desperate things when they are desperate. So again, this food insecurity problem we've seen with the war in Ukraine, for example, the blocking of shipments and so forth, the increasing grain prices, and that this can cause a lot of instability. As I said, my former classmate who watches this stuff closely, he was telling me he monitors and watches all of the global data. So, for example, the wheat stocks and grain stocks and everything like that, and how many days the global supply, the whole macro global supply is. And he was telling me about the environment. He says in some recent years that, there would be some variation of climate. So like the big grain producers, he said, maybe Canada has a poor harvest because of bad weather, but then Brazil would have a great harvest because the situation, environment was good. And then Ukraine would have a good harvest and so forth. But he said more and more, these regions that balance each other out, he says, seeing poor output or poor harvest, in Australia, Brazil, Canada, Ukraine, Russia, all at the same time, right? And that that cushion, that number of days of global food supply, he says it's shrunk. And, that kind of pressure, if we get closer to that edge, and if there are shortages, then of course people will do desperate things under those conditions. So hopefully these international efforts, these IGOs, these UN goals, that we can establish and sustain greater cooperation to address those, food insecurity, public health issues, damage to the oceans and waters and, everything else. So, but it's going to take a lot of work into the future. So, young people like you guys, it's your job to tackle this problem. The older generations, my generation and my parents and grandparents' generation, have not done such a good job as custodians of this. But, we're going to have to deal with it or suffer the consequences. So anyway, I hope that helped with your answer. If you guys have any follow-on questions or you think of something, said in the slides there, my contact information is there. You can shoot me a note, any clarification or questions or sources or anything like that. You can go ahead and fire away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Pinkston, or Professor Pinkston, about your presentation. That was insightful, focusing on the natural environment, domestic politics, and international relations, in answering the question why sustainable development is the key parameters to solve the global issues.